When we heard from Ryan, we're talking about economic development, we're talking about EDOs. One of the research projects that we've done at RDI is we've been working with the Winnipeg Foundation to understand the realities for community foundations in rural Manitoba. So I'll jump in a sec to the background, but I just wanted to sort of give a shout out to Gary. He's promised me no special treatment because he was on the project. So I actually expect to get the hook a bit early. And then we also worked with Endow Manitoba, which is sort of the rural research arm of the Winnipeg Foundation. And we had a grad student on the project, Richard Adu. So we're going to jump into why we do it, what we do, what we find, and what are next steps. I really do want to just jump right into that conversation, though, just to continue up on the questions. So this started from a previous project that we had done with Endow Manitoba. So RDI has actually been working with Winnipeg Foundation for 10, 15 years. And, we occasionally do projects with them. And so this one was looking at, just as COVID started, what are best practices in community foundations, right? They really wanted to know, and this is where the context comes in. So the story from Endow, when they approached us in 2020, and I wasn't expecting to get into this as much, but I think it's a really good tie-in, right? Was they were finding that their rural CFs were having to fill more and more of those gaps in rural communities. And, they wouldn't call it economic development, they wouldn't even call it community economic development, but they would call it community development, and they would call it community leadership. And what they were finding is that some of the community foundations were pretty nervous. They didn't know how to sort of take on this increased ask, increased responsibilities, but they were realizing quite quickly that they were some of the only granting done at the local level. And as more and more responsibilities were decentralized to these rural communities and the resources weren't matching, is that there was more and more requirements of the local organizations to do more. And so the Endow and the Winnipeg Foundation really wanted to understand, how do we help these community foundations sort of improve their practice, build their capacity, and sort of step up and sort of meet this new challenge. So that was in 2020, 2021. One of the first things that came out of that, and we sort of had a bit of a gap because of COVID. I came back on as the director at RDI in 2023. And so what they came back to us then, and they said, what we're really interested actually is this sort of one of the first steps is, how do we actually get more knowledge about our communities? Our community foundations are realizing that to do a better job meeting the needs of their communities, they need to know more about their communities. And one of the interesting contextual pieces here was there was a really sort of very fruitful and lively debate with some of the people at Endow, and sort of an ongoing discussion around what constitutes good community knowledge. Community foundations and small communities saying, I know what my community needs because I'm in the community, but they might not have the data to back that up. And there was some hesitancy by some of the partners to sort of say that that's actual valid knowledge. So we really wanted to go in and explore, how are community foundations collecting knowledge, what are they doing, what does that look like, and what do they use it for? So this project was bigger than just that, but this is a piece I really wanted to focus in on. So how are they collecting the community knowledge, and what do they use it for? So I'm doing something that I always tell my students not to do, putting in a method slide right at the start. I know this is an academic conference, but there's also practitioners and policymakers here. But this was a really interesting approach that we took, and it was driven with Endow Manitoba, and they invited us to come to their conference. They set up a special session for us, and we actually worked with the community foundations. There were 6 of them that were engaged and interested in doing this. And one of the interesting pieces in this project was we worked with the community foundations to sort of figure out what the best methods were as we were going forward. So they were all there in person, 6 across southern Manitoba. There was about 400 kilometers between the furthest communities. So it wasn't easy to get them in the room together, right? And they actually, researchers, right, we want to talk to each other. And so they actually saw this as an opportunity to, when we're doing the research, to learn from one another, not just to share with the researchers. So they asked us to come and talk to them at a conference. And we actually, as you can see, we talk about Post-it notes and flip charts. And so we actually had them on a wall mapping things out in terms of their community knowledge. But we also had to talk to them during the summer, during harvest, during holiday time. And so we weren't able to bring them together. So we used a virtual approach. And actually, I'm going to give a shout out to Ashley. This was something I'd seen her do on Miro in the past. And so we used Miro as sort of a virtual facilitated Post-it note session. And we were able to take, in the second round, we were able to take to actually, give us the content and help us use Post-it notes on the virtual set. And it was really interesting because they were able to then have the conversation and see as we're going, building the research and building the data. So specifically, what did we find? So again, we went out and we talked to 6 communities over multiple rounds of interviews and focus groups. And we found that there's more than 40 different ways that they collect community knowledge, right? And again, the presumption by some of the partners was that they had one way. You had people sitting around the table saying, and that was, board knowledge and experience was consistent across all of the boards. But they also talked about that in a very strategic way. They talked about, well, we make sure we have board members that are also on the school board, or we make sure we have board members. So many of the CFs were actually doing strategic recruitment of board members so that they could make sure that they had a good pulse, right? Had a good feel for what was going on in the community. They would read through, and community foundations, one of their main raisons d'etre is to sort of give out grants. And so they would make sure that as they're reviewing the grants, they'd be like, okay, this is what's happening with the school, or this is what's happening with that community group, or this is what's happening with that festival. And so they'd use that knowledge, right, as an opportunity to sort of build their understanding of what's happening in the community. One of the things, and it's actually not sort of a focus here, but one of the things in the larger project is we're really sort of emphasizing that, document this knowledge, formalize it, and it becomes a much more robust and easier piece to use. So if you're having board meetings and you have a check-in with everybody, document that knowledge, right? And then that's something that you can bring. Do some summaries of what's in your grants. You don't need to speak to the specific individual grants, but you can talk about those general issues that are coming up in your community, and then you can use that in your reporting and to sort of do more of that work in the community. Another one was local partners. So the community foundations are really good at having events and having engaging with others, whether it's in the festivals or some of those projects that they support. So they made sure that they were always active and engaged in those. And so it was our qualitative research, right? Snowball sampling, those sorts of things. We also asked what they use the information for. So again, these are community foundations. They're trying to step up and sort of fill in this gap around community development activities, self-perpetuating. So they say, okay, we know more about what's happening in the community. We heard from one of the CFs that in newcomer groups, and they identified that we need to make sure that we have newcomer groups on our board, right? And they're able to use that information and sort of strategically do that. Another one that they would use it for was for community engagement, making sure they know where and when and how that they need to sort of get involved with the community. They used it for community granting and priorities, and they used it for community development and action. So there weren't not all of the CFs were doing community projects on their own, but a couple of them were, and they would use this information that they'd gotten to do that. So one of the things we did, and when you saw that first picture when we had a grid of painters and them to identify the community knowledge that they use, but we were actually asking them to sort of rank it on that matrix, right? How hard is that? Going back to Ryan's comment about statistics, you can imagine how hard it is for EDOs to get access to statistics, to figure them out, and then to communicate it. At a community foundation, statistics they identified it as a possible source, but it was definitely ranked sort of in the hard, right, off the table for many of the foundations. We know it's important, but we don't have the capacity, we don't have the time, we don't have the ability to go and figure out how to do these community profiles with statistics. And we went through that with all those 40 types of community knowledge that they gathered. What we found was that they really focused in on the easy to use. And so we really understood that, these community foundations, they're working really hard for them to get access to. Some of the key challenges that they talked about, again, was data collection is time intensive, interpretation and communication of data, stats, understanding what that data means. It's not just that they knew it was important and they didn't have time, they were really cautious about misrepresenting the data. And we understand that as academics, right? We're very careful about getting into either a topic or a field or a method that we're not comfortable with until we've studied it and used it. And they were exactly the same. We're like, we don't want to get the stats wrong, right? We don't want to misrepresent this. And so instead of, we're not going to try, we're actually be more cautious and sort of pull back. So that was one of their key things. So when we talk about training and capacity building at a local level, there's definitely a desire for that from the community foundations. What we did do is we were able to sort of use that mapping, and we were able to use those conversations, those interviews, to sort of create this matrix. Use, moderate to use, hard to find. These were sort of the top 9, top 10 that they'd identified, and were common between sort of all of the community foundations. What we also found was that there was a bit of a capacity spectrum for how they used it as well, right? So board development and recruitment, that was a low-hanging fruit. There was a lot of work around community engagement and community granting. And then, like I said, only some of the more robust boards actually use things for community development and action. Going back to Ryan's comments, we talked to 6 community foundations. Only 2 had paid staff, right? And one of those was part-time. So you had 6 foundations. There was 1 full-time, executive director, 1 part-time executive director, and the rest were volunteer boards. So, it's really obvious and it's really understandable, how their capacity fits in and their ability to use the community data. So what came out of this specifically around generating community data and for community foundations and how they go forward? They're really wanting to build their capacity to do data, right? They're really cautious about it, but they really want to know more. They really want to do more. One of the great things was, again, they wanted to talk together, not just to us, and actually, they really appreciated the conversations. I think they appreciated even more the sort of the atmosphere and the ability to have the conversation. What tools are you using, right? So they wanted a data repository so that they could share between the communities. They also wanted the opportunity to build their capacity. And the other thing that came out of it that was really important was they wanted the right tools and the right skills for what they needed. It really sort of backs up all the stuff we've heard about place-based and the rural lens, right? It wasn't just enough to have a tool, right? They needed to make sure that they had the right tool and then the right skills for those tools. So in terms of next steps, there's a report that's coming out on this next month. It'll be up on the RDI website. It's really been a central piece for us, for Gary and I and some of the students that are working on it. This was a really, we did this research in 2024, and since that, we've been using it and reflecting on it and understanding how do we help these community organizations develop community development skills, right? Whether it's leadership, whether it's data collection, right? Whether it's collaboration, whether it's project management. And so I'm just going to give a shout out for Gary's poster, because one of the next steps that we took from this project was to actually do a scan across the province and a little bit across the nation about what kind of community development and community economic development training is available. In Manitoba, there's some great work from Community Futures and from the Economic Development Association of Manitoba that does onboarding to sort of Community Economic Development 101. And then there's a big gap once you finish that. And really formal training, it's almost up to the Masters of Rural Development at the university. So if you're a community member that wants to sort of say, okay, I know why data is important now, but how do I actually do that within a CED framework? You have to actually go from online workshop to your Masters in terms of what's available right now. So that's one of the things that we're sort of trying to figure out at RDI is how do we recognize or fill those gaps, and work with partners to fill those gaps, but also how do we help those communities, understand what are the right skills at the right time for the right project.